All right, so we may start now. Good morning, everyone in Europe, and good afternoon in Vietnam. Welcome to this new session of the GEM Vietnam webinar series. My name is Etienne Espine. I'm a senior economist at the French Agency of Development, in charge of this GEM Vietnam project. And today I have the pleasure to welcome Professor Manh Hung Nguyen from Toulouse School of Economics and Professor Viet Cuong Nguyen from Hanoi National University. So Manh Hung and Viet Cuong, you will be chairing this session on the impacts of climate change on health and mortality. And I think we have two presenters. Basically, Thi Lan Nguyen from INRAE will present on health, and Viet Cuong, you will present yourself on the mortality topic. The two combined, you will have 30 minutes of presentation, more or less, and I will cut you after that. And then we will have two discussants. First, Professor Aditya Goenka from Birmingham University. And second, we have Professor Xiong Thanh Long from National Economics University. And here again, you will have, let's say, 30 minutes combined with the responses from the presenters. And we will open the floor to the general audience for the last more or less 30 minutes. So without further introduction, I give the floor to Manh Hung for the beginning of this webinar. Manh Hung, the floor is yours. Manh Hung, are you with us? I think we can't hear you. I don't know.
To the seminar on the topic of environmental health and climate change. So I'm happy to be co-chair with Dr. Cuong today. So we are going to present the chapter 3, where we have two main topics, the infectious disease and mortality, and then we have two presentation. Here, Dr. Lan Anh will present the talk on the impact of climate change on infectious disease, and Viet Cuong will present on the impact on mortality. So there are other aspects of health, but here we focus on two main outcomes, that is the infectious disease and mortality. But we also link to some problem of labor productivity, so where climate change may reduce health capital and health status, and two may reduce human capital, and that we can link to the impact to economic, and that we need to get discussion and comment from you. So we would like to invite Dr. Lan Anh for the first presentation. So you will have about 50 minutes. Okay, Lan Anh, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. So let me share screen. So good morning and good afternoon, everyone. Thank you very much for attending the seminar today. Now, on behalf of my team, I will present our working paper on climate change and infectious disease in Vietnam, from evidence to public health policy. So looking back to the background of the topic, it is found that climate change can affect the transmission of virus and bacteria, and there is an extensive evidence on the impact of temperature on infectious disease. However, the magnitude of that effect is not consistent, but it differs and varies across nations, regions, and individuals due to the difference in the exposure and the resilience to the infectious disease. And in Vietnam, one of the most vulnerable countries to climate change, it is found that the number of people at risk of infectious disease will dramatically increase in the absence of public intervention. And this figure presents the relationship between climate change, infectious disease, and people and humans. And climate change is represented by the variation in climate variables such as temperature, precipitation, and wind. And the pathogens are disease agents such as virus, bacteria, and the hosts are the living organisms such as animals and plants where the pathogen live in. The change in climate will influence the life cycle and the distribution of pathogens, the host and their transmission environment, and it will lead to the outbreak of many types of infectious disease, such as vector-borne, waterborne, and airborne disease. Moreover, climate change and infectious disease will have an impact on social economics, such as labor productivity and the health, such as mortality and another health disease. But in the long term, people will respond to climate change and infectious disease by applying several adaptation measures. For looking back to our working paper, our objective is to estimate the short-term effects of weather variation and long-term effects of climate on the incidence of multiple infectious disease in Vietnam. And here we take into account the role of public health expenditures. And secondly, we want to estimate the indirect economic cost of infectious disease through labor productivity loss due to infectious disease. And we will use the data of infectious disease published by Ministry of Health. It is monthly infections and deaths by 28 disease at the province level in the period of 10 years from 2009 to 2018. But here we only focus to 12 common disease, and we separated into 3 main categories, including vector-borne type, airborne type, and waterborne type. And we also use the healthcare expenditure data. Is also published by Ministry of Health, and it is a yearly health budget at the province level and in the period of 10 years.
Lan, sorry to interrupt. I think we can't see the slide properly. It stops at the first one. Can you try to re-share the slides and put them full screen?
Yes. Okay, so I will stop share and then I will share it again. So can you see my slide?
Not yet.
Or maybe it's due to my internet.
Okay, so now we can see the slides, but it's not full screen.
Yes. So you can see my next slide. Can you see it?
Background here.
So you don't see my I'm moving.
We see the third slide for now.
So this is the slide about data?
No, it's not.
So what happened with that?
Sorry,
Chị Lan ơi, chị có thể
chị ơi, chị bấm vào cái chỗ cái nút mà cạnh phần trăm ấy ạ. Như bình thường mình trình chiếu mình bấm vào đó nó full màn hình ý. Chị chưa bấm cho nó full lên thôi ạ. Chị vẫn share bình thường đi. Chị share bình thường xong rồi cái chỗ gần phần trăm nó có một cái biểu tượng giống như cái màn chiếu ấy.
Đây.
Gần chỗ 65, đúng rồi, chị bấm vào đấy đi.
Nhưng mà vấn đề là mọi người không nhìn được chị đang sang cái slide khác ấy, nó vẫn dừng ở là slide
Không phải đâu, vẫn chị bấm full lên đi là mọi người vẫn nhìn thấy đấy ạ. Có thể là do cái internet của chị nó đang không tốt, nó load hơi bị chậm. Nhưng mà chị ấn vào cái biểu tượng màn chiếu đấy đi, xong là nó sẽ full lên ạ.
Chị ấn rồi đấy.
Nó đang bị đơ, hình như là mình đang bị đơ. Em sẽ stop share xong chị share lại nhá.
Ok, chị thử stop. Sorry, so can you see my next slide about?
I can see the
yeah, I only can see the background.
Hiện tại vẫn chưa thấy đâu chị ạ, chỉ có thể nhấn F5 thử xem là nó có trình chiếu full sao.
Maybe Manh Hung, if you have the same slides, you can share them. That might work better due to internet connection.
Yeah, let me...
I think maybe not due to the internet connection, because I can hear you clearly.
We can see the model slide now, so it takes time,
okay.
I guess, but not full screen. If you can put it full screen, that would be much better. And then we can start.
Okay, so I think I will continue my presentation. Sorry for the technical problem.
No problem.
Yeah, so in order to estimate the short-term effect of weather variation, we will use a linear model where the dependent variable is the number of infected cases by disease category in a province P in the month M of the year T. And the independent variables include the temperature, the rainfall, and the wind speed. And here for the temperature, we divided in the temperature into different bins, and we calculate the number of days in the temperature bin in a province P in the month M of the year T. And we also allow for several fixed effects: the category of disease, the province, category multiplied by month, and the category multiplied by province. And secondly, to estimate the long-term effects of climate on the incidence of infectious disease. Sorry, can you see my next slide? The second model?
No.
No.
So sorry.
I have the slides. So if you want me to use my screen to show the slides, I can do it.
Maybe let's try that. Maybe
let's try that. Yeah. Then you just tell me next. I'll move to the next slide.
Yes. Okay. Thank you very much.
Okay.
I will stop sharing. Professor Aditya, can I send you my latest slide, and then you can download it?
Tại em đang thấy chị Lan Anh là đang chưa xem lại màn hình ạ. Nếu chị xem lại màn hình thì có thể nhấn biểu tượng, nếu mà không được thì chị thử nhấn F5 cho em được không?
Chị Lan Anh có vẻ như cái internet của chị nó không upload nổi đâu. Nếu được chị có thể gửi gấp luôn bài cho Linh bên em đi ạ. Linh sẽ upload hộ chị ạ. Và chị chỉ cần nói next slide, next slide, next slide là được ạ. Tại vì cái tín hiệu internet nó có thể là đường tiếng nó ok, nhưng mà upload lên là một cái lượng file nặng ấy chị Lan Anh. Thì
thì email của Linh
gửi
em
ra
có
thôi.
gửi tin nhắn riêng chị rồi đấy ạ. Bây giờ
Lan
em
Anh,
gửi
you
cho
send
chị nhé.
the latest slide to me and Aditya. And Linh Ha also, yeah, we try to.
Em có gửi tin nhắn riêng cho chị để chị Lan Anh ạ. Chị có thể check và gửi qua đấy giúp em nhé.
Đây chị gửi cho em. Thầy Hùng ơi, hay là em nghĩ là có nên hay anh Cường có trình bày trước em không để đỡ mọi người phải chờ ạ?
Okay, so I'm just going to share screen and hopefully it'll work.
Okay, it worked.
So,
You can see it.
Yes.
Screen.
Slideshow, yeah.
Yeah.
Okay, so yeah,
And
perfect. Thank you.
Okay.
Can you move to the second slide of the model?
I think.
Yes, thank you very much.
Lan Anh, can you maybe talk again about very short about the general model, the finger, maybe the second slide, that we can get an overview of the climate change impact on both, on not only infection disease but also mortality for the chapter.
Okay.
I think that's very important.
So Professor Aditya, can you move
this
to
one?
the
yes,
yes,
this one, yeah.
So the figure presents the relationship between climate change, infectious disease, and humans. Climate change is represented by the variation of climate variables such as temperature, precipitation, and wind, and the pathogens are disease agents such as virus and bacteria, and the hosts are living organisms such as animals or plants where the pathogens live in. And the change in climate will influence the life cycle and the distribution of the pathogens, the host, and their transmission environment. And it will lead to the outbreak of many types of infectious disease, such as vector-borne disease, waterborne, and airborne disease. Moreover, climate change and infectious disease will have an impact on social economics, such as labor productivity, and health, such as mortality and other health disease. In the long term, human will respond to climate change and infectious disease by applying several adaptation measures. So can you move to another slide?
Okay.
The one about model. Yeah.
Yeah, thank you.
Yes, so in order to estimate the short-term effects of weather variation, we will use a linear model where the dependent variables is the number of infected cases by disease category in province P in the month M of the year T, and the independent variable include the temperature, the rainfall, and the wind speed. And for the temperature, we divided the temperature into different bins, and we calculate the number of days in that temperature bin for in province B in the month M of the year T. And here we account for several types of fixed effect, the category of disease, the province, category multiplied by month, and category multiplied by province. Can you move to the next slide? Yeah. And secondly, in order to estimate a long-term effects of climate on the incidence of infectious disease, we allowed an interaction between the temperature being multiplied by the rolling mean of temperature and the rolling mean of healthcare to account for the climate and the healthcare expenditure of the province. Can you move to, yeah. And this is the result for estimation of the first model. The parameter for the temperature at the bin 15 to 18, 24 to 27, and 27 to 30 is significant and positive. And it means that the disease infections significantly increase a number of days with temperature under the bin 50 and 80 and 24 to 50 compared to the reference bin. On the other hand, we find a negative relation between infections and the number of days with the temperature under the bin 18 to 21st. However, there is no evidence for the impact of extreme temperature, including below 15 and above 30 Celsius degree on disease infections. And it can be explained by the finding in previous studies that the optimal lifespan of pathogens is typically found around 15 to 30 Celsius degrees. Can you move to the next slide? In order to in the second model, we want to estimate the impact of weather on infections, but here we account for the long-term climate and the health budget of the province. And from the table, if we look to the second column for the estimation of all types of disease, we can see that the parameter for temperature from 15 to 18 multiplied by province climate is significant and positive, while the parameter for temperature under the bin 24 to 30 multiplied by province climate is negative. So what does it mean? It means that the infection by disease in a province with long-term climate at a higher temperature is less sensitive to one additional day under temperature 24 to 30, but is more impacted by one additional day under the temperature 15 to 18 Celsius degrees. And it indicates that in a hotter province, infectious disease are more impacted by colder weather, but less impacted by higher temperature, and vice versa. In cold province, infectious disease are less impacted by colder temperature, but more sensitive to hotter temperature. And this finding could reflect a side of adaptability in the climate of hotter province or hot range of temperature, and in colder province to a cold range of temperature. And regarding to marginal effect of health budget, the parameter for all bin of temperature are negative. Also, only the parameter for the bin 18 to 21st is significant. And it suggests that the health budget lessens the sensitivity of infections to temperature. And moreover, when we separate into three types of disease, the study finds different marginal effects of long-term climate and a health budget on the incidence of infections across three diseases. Can you move to another? And in this figure, visualize the sensitivity of infections to temperature by provinces, and it can be seen that provinces located in the south and in the southern central coast appear to have a higher level of sensitivity to infections to the temperature 15 to 18 Celsius degree, but a lower level of being affected at to the temperature 27 to 30 Celsius degrees, whereas the northern and Tây Nguyên provinces are less sensitive to infections at the 15 to 18 Celsius degree, but more sensitive at 27 to 30 Celsius degrees. Can you move to another? Yeah. And the label, and in this, and thirdly, we want to see the impact of infections by disease on labor productivity. And the labor productivity here is represented by hourly wage of labor. We account for labor characteristics, including age, gender, education, and insurance. And the results suggest a negative influence of infections on labor productivity. Can you move to next slide? And finally, we project the future impact on infection corresponding to two scenarios, RCP 4.5 and RCP 8.5, with and without adaptation. And this table shows a future infections in some provinces of Vietnam. Professor Editor, can you move to the next slide? And these figures visualize the log of the ratio of number of infection in the year 2050 to number of infection in the year 2015 into scenario with and without adaptation. And here we control for the adaptation, we control for the health budget and the climate of province. And from the visualization, there are two implications. First, the incidence of infection increased between 2015 and 2050 without adaptation, but it is decreased when we account for adaptation. And secondly, the increase and the decrease of infections varies across provinces. So there are three main points for the findings. Firstly, we found that temperature and wind speed affect three major types of infectious disease, although at similar levels. And secondly, we found that the effects are heterogeneous across different regions of Vietnam, and it depends on the role of healthcare expenditure. For example, more specific, the cold region will have a higher incidence rate of disease when the temperature increases. But for the hot region, it will have a higher disease impact when the region, when the province temperature decrease. And finally, we found a potential indirect cost of infectious disease induced by labor productivity loss. A 1% increase in disease infections will lead to a decrease in the average hourly wage of about 0.05%. And there are several policy recommendations. Firstly, we found that human adaptation and public health strategy play an important role in infectious disease outbreak. So we recommend that adaptation strategy should be based on the local context. Secondly, we found that the loss of working capacity would be a serious and medical cost for highly vulnerable populations. So we recommend that universal health care and insurance could be an effective measure along with epidemic prevention. And finally, the health budget of Vietnam plays an important role in lessening the sensitivity of infection to disease. However, the funding for infectious disease control and prevention mainly depends on local financial capacity. So we suggest that the government should have support programs for poor provinces and disadvantaged groups. And there are several lines for future research. There is an extensive evidence on dilution effect, meaning the biodiversity loss will increase the infectious disease, and so we think of to do a research on the impact of climate change and biodiversity collapse on the transmission of infectious disease. Can you move to the next slide? So here we can account for the migration and the urbanization and the human density, and we can use some latest technique on difference estimation to estimate the impact of shocks on weather and biodiversity loss. And this is the end of my presentation. Thank you very much, and I look forward to your question and your discussion.
Okay.
Sorry, I'm so sorry for the technical issue. Thank you very much, Professor Aditya.
Okay, thank you, Lan. So I think the question and discussion will be at the end of the presentation. So now we move to the second presentation by Dr. Cuong.
Thank you, Dr. Hùng. So I will share my screen. Do you see my screen?
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. Okay. Thank you for attending our workshop. So following the Lan Anh presentation, we would like to share our finding on the effect of climate change on the mortality. So we see that the cold and the hot weather, they can cause the disease. And the next question is whether the disease they can lead to the mortality in Vietnam. So this work we by the Manh Hung Nguyen from the National Australia National University and me. Because of the time limited, so I will skip the background. We all know that the climate change and the extreme weather, they are very harmful to the health. But finding on the effect of the climate change or the extreme weather on the mortality is rather limited, especially in the low and middle income country. So that's why in this study we aim to estimate the effect of the climate change on the mortality in Vietnam. So we have the four main research questions. The first one is the effect of the climate change, the weather extreme on the mortality in Vietnam, and the second is the heterogeneous effect of the climate change on the mortality. The next question is we want to understand how the people they respond to the climate change on the mortality, whether having the air condition, healthcare, and the migration can reduce the adverse effect of the climate change on the mortality. And finally, we do some projection of the cost of the climate change and also project the mortality caused by climate change in the future. To measure mortality, we use a monthly mortality at the provincial level from the GSO, from the census 1999 to 2019, and we use this data are computed from the population census and annual population trend survey. So the mortality rate in Vietnam, here we compute the root death ratio, so that the number of deaths per 1,000 people. So on average, the death ratio is quite stable and it's around 5 deaths per 1,000 per year. So from this period, from 2019 and the death is the higher for the older people and smaller for the adult. This figure, they show the death ratio, the death rate by the, sorry, is the average temperature. So maybe I skip this one. In this slide, we graph the mortality rate, number of deaths per 1,000 people by province. We use the pool data from 2000 and 2018, and we use the pool. And next is also the pool data on the temperature. So we can see that the mortality rate is higher in the northern mountain and also in the central coast and in the Mekong River Delta. So mortality rate is depend not only on the health but also the characteristic of the demography. In some province, maybe the migration they can also affect the mortality rate. About the temperature, we see some correlation in the very cold area, like in the northern mountain and on the hot area Mekong River, we see higher mortality rate. But whether it's the correlation or the causal effect, we need to use a regression to answer that question. Similar to Lan Anh presentation, we also use a bean. We measure the climate change by the distribution of the temperature. So the number of days falling in different beans during the time. A limitation of the bean is that we cannot capture for example, in error, we can see that 5 days with the high temperature, but if the days they happen, the hot day it happen continuously, so the effect will be higher than the hot days they happen separately. So that's why we also define the extreme weather by cold and heat wave, and we also take into account that the adaptation of the people. You can see that in the south it's very hot, so people they can familiar with the temperature around 30. But in the north area, the people they might not familiar with the high temperature. They are more familiar with the low temperature. So that's why we define the cold and the heat wave based on the temperature distribution during the past 20 years in that province. So specifically, we define the cold wave, heat wave as a number of days, number of consecutive days with the temperature, with the daily mean temperature at or above the 95 percentile of the province specific temperature. And similarly, we define the cold wave as a number of the consecutive days that's below the 5 percentile of the province specific temperature distribution. And for Robinich, we also define the cold wave and heat wave as a 5 or 7 or 9 consecutive days. And we also use other threshold at the 10 to define the cold wave and the 19 percentile to define the heat wave. So these figures we show the number, the average number of consecutive days below to the 15 and above the 30. So we use the absolutely the temperature to define the cold wave and heat wave. And in the next panel, B, we use the relatively distribution. So the number of consecutive days below the 15 percentile or above the 50 percentile. That's the compute for all the province. So we average across province and we across 20 years. So that is the number of days per year on average. So we see that, for example, here we see that the number of cold wave with the 3 consecutive days below to the 5 percentile, they are the 15 days below that. When we define the co-wave as a longer duration, we see that the number of co-wave and heat wave is a decrease. Yeah. And the next is the number of the consecutive hot days in the heat wave. In terms of the econometric, we also use a similar model like Lanang. We regress the mortality rate of the month in a given month by month on the temperature beam, and we control for other variable. We also use the same model to estimate the effect of the cold wave and heat wave on the mortality rate, the monthly mortality rate. So this is our findings. The first finding, we want to see where the distribution of the temperature that can affect the mortality rate, and we use a reference. Bean is from the 21 to 24 degree. Basically, we do not see the effect of the number of days with the very low temperature or the high temperature on the mortality rate. However, when we use we combine the reference temperature from the 15 degree to the 30 degree, we see the positive effect of the number of very of the day above 30 degree on the mortality, and the column 5 and 6 we define the hot wave and the low and the high temperature, not by absolute number but by the below 5 percentile of the daily temperature or above the 95 percentile of the distribution. Now we see that the people living in the province with the low or the high temperature, they are more likely to die. And next, we use a definition of the cold and heat wave to measure the effect of the weather extreme on the log of the mortality. And we also see that the estimate is consistent using different definition of the cold and heat wave. So higher, very cold and very hot, they increase the probability of the death. In our study, we do a lot of probability check and the placebo test. So we are very confident that our estimate is very robust, and the people, they are vulnerable to the cold and the heat wave. Even you know that in Vietnam, the cold temperature is not very low. It's not below 0 like other country, in like some country, but not very hot. But still, we see that the effect of the cold and the heat wave on mortality. We do some heterogeneous effect, and basically we find the effect is stronger for the older people, especially the people they above the 80. So the older people, they're very vulnerable to the cold as well as the heat wave. The effect do not differ between the male and female, or the do not differ for the province with a different education or the income level. Finally, we try to see how the people they respond to the cold wave and heat wave, and the finding as presented very detailed in our book and also in the chapter in our working paper. But here I summarize that the people, they tend to in order to cope with the cold wave and heat wave, they tend to migration. So that's the first, and that's the main we see that. So they increase they reduce the population density, and they increase the out migration. in response to the cold and the heat wave. And next we see whether that the responses they can mitigate the effect of the cold and the heat wave. And overall, we find that in province with the more out migration, we see that the effect of the cold and heat wave on the mortality rate is smaller, and also the province with the higher spending on the health from the government, we also see the lower the effect of the more of the cold wave and heat wave on the mortality. And finally, we project the using the project data on the temperature in the Vietnam under different PCP scenario from the 2020 to 2100. So over time, the number of cold wave and heat wave is decreased. On the other hand, the number of the number of cold wave is decreased in the future, but the number of the heat wave is increased in the future because the scenario based on the assumption that the future will have the higher temperature. So because of the higher temperature, so the number of people they caused by the heat wave will increase over time. On the other hand, the number of death by the heat wave is decreased, so that the intuitive. So overall, the conclusion that the mortality of the people, especially the older people, they are very vulnerable to the both cold wave and heat wave in Vietnam. So in order to respond to the cold wave, heat wave, the people they tend to have to migrate, and in the province with the large out migration, we see that the lower effect of the cold wave and heat wave on the mortality, and public spending on the healthcare also help people mitigate the effect of the cold wave and heat wave. So that's our study, and thank you very much.
Okay, thank you, Viet Cuong. So let's move on to the first discussion by Professor Aditya Goenka.
Okay, just let me share my screen. So I hope you can see the full screen.
Yeah.
Okay. So first of all, I must thank Dr. Lan Ai and Professor Viet Cuong for a very good summary of the very complex results that have been obtained on the effect of climate change on infectious diseases and mortality. What I will do is I'll make some general comments, which I think so apply to both those presentations, both those parts in the report, and then I will talk about the different presentations separately. So the work is looking at average changes, but this hides a very complex picture on what is the effect of climate change. The heterogeneous impacts due to changes in temperature and rainfall. Temperatures, the main focus, I think, in the work, and it's a more significant effect. The effect on mortality, which is largely due to non-infectious diseases, and the effect on incidence of infectious diseases is complex because different infectious diseases are affected differently by climate change. Similarly, on mortality, there is a lot of heterogeneity in terms of which group is affected, which region is affected. It depends on what is the general climate in that particular region. So given that there is a large dispersion of Vietnam being a large country in terms of, from north to south, and the highland region and the coastal regions, there's going to be a lot of heterogeneity in the impacts at the provincial level. The other thing which this work suggests is that there could be nonlinearity and threshold effects. So I think in future work, these nonlinearities and threshold effects could be explored in greater detail. But what I'm going to do now is talk about the two different parts one by one. So if you look at the picture of infectious diseases from Professor Viet Cuong's presentation, it is clear that the large driver for mortality in Vietnam now is non-infectious diseases. However, illness from infectious diseases is still important. And what may also happen is, due to climate change and changes in biodiversity, there can be new infectious diseases which emerge. This is not captured in the data because this is looking at diseases which are already endemic. This can become a big challenge, as we have seen from the case of COVID. We have seen from the case of SARS about 20 years ago, and for different episodes of avian flu. So if the pattern of infectious diseases changes, it is going to have big impacts, which is not covered in this analysis. As it was made clear, extreme weather events seem to have small effects. And the effect of climate change is different for waterborne diseases and vector-borne diseases. So small changes in temperature, small variations in temperature could still have large effects because the pattern of disease incidence is changing on the margin. There could be regions where some disease is not very prevalent, and it could become more prevalent because of small changes in temperature. So these small changes in climate patterns has the potential to have differential health impacts in different regions. Now, in terms of looking at the effect on labor productivity, it seems small if you look at it, that 1% increase in infections leads to a decrease in average hourly wage of 0.05%. However, this hides the differential impact which is going to be faced by different sections of the population. So more vulnerable, poorer sections of population, for them, even a small change in the wages has big consequences. The second thing is, all the evidence worldwide suggests that the poorest and more vulnerable sections of the population also have larger incidence of infectious diseases. So small changes in the pattern of infectious diseases could have large social impact because it has differential impact within the population. So there's going to be a challenge how to adapt social insurance and health systems to accommodate for these different patterns. So there are some suggestions in both the presentations, and I think so they need to be considered very seriously. The last point I would like to make in this context is that here we are treating health effect as exogenous, but our research shows that how much health expenditure is made also depends on the level of income and whether the region is growing or not. So there's the issue of capacity, health capacity, but there's also the incentive issue that what is the best use of resources for a province which is facing an incidence of infectious diseases. Sometimes, paradoxically, it may not be in the best interest to control the disease because there may be more pressing needs than controlling the effect of infectious diseases. So this should be kept in mind when we think about how to control for the evolution of infectious diseases in Vietnam. If we come to the case of mortality, that's a second presentation by Professor Viet Cuong. In Vietnam, the mortality rates have remained stable, except for a sharp decrease in infant mortality. So the demographic change is coming from a decrease in infant mortality and also a decline in fertility rates. So what is going to happen over a period of time, the age distribution is going to change. Eventually, the population from being a very young population is going to become a more aging population. And one has to think about this in terms of thinking about climate change because it's an ongoing long-run problem. What we see is the length of the heat wave and the length of the cold waves matter. So there's some non-linearity which is perhaps taking place. And what we also see is that the effect is largely felt by those over 80 years old. But we must remember that the 70 years old will become 80 years old over a period of time. The 60-year-olds will become 80-year-olds over a period of time. So we have to think far ahead in not just the short run. The question is whether the patterns of these heat and cold waves is changing over time, and the last few slides made this very clear. So what we have seen, the figures show that the duration of cold waves is likely to decrease, but the duration of heat waves is likely to increase. And this is going to have significant effects on mortality. Now, this changes in pattern in the length of heat waves is going to affect life expectancy. And changes in life expectancy, what we know from other contexts, has growth effects because it affects incentives to accumulate different kinds of capital, both health capital, human capital, and physical capital. So this has to be taken into account thinking about the longer run. I will stop at this point and come back if there are any further questions.
Okay, thank you very much. Very interesting and insightful discussion, Aditya. So we will discuss more on this point, important point after the second discussion. So now I'd like to invite Professor Giang Thanh Long for the second discussion.
Okay, good morning and good afternoon, everyone in the seminar. First, I would like to thank all of you for inviting me to join this very interesting seminar. And also thanks Lan Anh and Cường for making a very good presentation. And as invited, I would like to discuss about the chapter 3 in very big book, Climate Change Impact and Adaptation in Vietnam. Let me share my screen. Can you see now?
Yeah.
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. So actually, I also do agree with many points that Professor Nguyen already mentioned in this in his presentation. And in my presentation, I will not repeat that one. Instead, I will try my best to speak shortly and also raise some question about the modeling and also the result for the chapter. In general, this chapter includes a very interesting finding on the impact of climate change on health. In this case, you discuss about the infectious disease and mortality rate, as well as work, in this case, labor productivity in Vietnam. And it shows that the heterogeneous impact of climate change on different group of people, depending on age group, sex, educational level, and also insurance status. And based on the finding, you already provided some very important policy implication, especially on healthcare and particularly on preventive care, along with universal health insurance in Vietnam. For the specific comment, the first one, the impact of climate change on infectious disease. I think that in the model by Cuong, he mentioned about the population density, but in the modeling for the infectious disease impact, I couldn't find the role of population density and movement, because as Professor Nguyen already mentioned, the COVID-19 showed very important implication for population density and movement, right? In terms of infectious disease. So I hope that maybe in the future, maybe this kind of information can be taken into account in the model. And the second one, I think it's also in line with what Professor Nguyen just mentioned about the health budget in Vietnam. Actually, to date, the health budget in Vietnam has been allocated using the register population size rather than the health situation of different population age structure. For instance, in Hanoi, you have very huge number of population. It's around 8.5 million. And at the same time, in Hanoi, we have more than 12% of people age 60 and over. We call older person. So, but at the same time, in other provinces in northern mountainous area or in central highland, we have very small size population as well as young population structure. So maybe these provinces, they face different healthcare needs. And that is why maybe they require different, healthcare budget. But in Vietnam, traditionally, the health budget allocated by the just, population size. And therefore, I think that, along with that kind of population size and age structure, some changing in the migration, our migration and in migration that Cuong already mentioned, also important in taking into account, the budget allocation for health. And the other one maybe missing from the estimation is that, especially related to healthcare, is that the spending on by health insurance and also our pocket payment quite different between provinces. And once people have different, living conditions, they also have different payment or spending by health insurance and also our pocket. And therefore, they face different situation of infectious disease. And I think that's also important factor that we need to think about in modeling, even at the provincial level. The second one, the impact on labor productivity. I think that if you just taking into account the hourly wage in the model, maybe it's a bit simplified, because that people with different job, maybe they have different hour wage, and also when they working in different sector, they also have like a different kind of working condition and also hourly wage, and therefore maybe the productivity, which is a proxy by the hourly wage, maybe could not reflect the whole story about the impact of weather condition on the labor productivity. So that is my feeling about the data and also the modeling when you use labor force survey, which is lack of a lot of information related to weather condition. For the last one with Cuong's presentation, I think the impact of mortality on by age group are quite clear, because different groups, they have different mobility. For instance, according to our national survey on older person in 2019, an older person in Vietnam has on average about 3.1 diseases. And of course, compare with younger generation, younger population group, maybe they have less number of disease. And that is why, again, the age structure of provincial population may be strongly related to health status, and therefore the mortality rate. And I think that is very important for us to think about the situation. The other one that I also just want to mention is that even in the same weather condition, but the living condition and healthcare system, especially the differences between the rural and urban area in terms of allocation of healthcare station, which is very important for accessibility or adequacy or affordability of population in one province. They will affect on the health status of people, and therefore it also influence the mortality rate. And I just wonder how this factor could be considered in the model. And of course, at the end of the slide that Lan Anh already mentioned, she also mentioned about the future research, and I could find some similar ideas that she already mentioned. For instance, the difference in terms of health budget and some kind of integration of the health system and also living condition. So thanks again for making very good presentation about the impact of climate change on health, and thank you for your attention.
Excellent. Thank you very much, Professor Long. It's very nice discussion. So we should acknowledge that still many limitations in this research, and as you have mentioned, and so now we open for the discussion. Maybe first Lan Anh or Viet Cuong can react to some point that discussion from Professor Aditya and Long first. Maybe that for example, Cuong, can you reply to some point?
Thank you. Yeah. So I think the overall the comment from Aditya and Dr. Long is relevant. So we try to take into account in the future study. If and a small point, the small comment from the Dr. Long about the population density. So actually, in the model, we also already control for the population density of the province. So with and without the population density, the result is very similar. Thank you.
And we welcome to all the questions from the audience. So please put your question in the chat box, and then we try to answer you directly. I just have some small response to the discussion. Here, actually, we evaluate the impact of climate change on health outcome. So climate change here, we mostly focus on temperature, rainfall, and some extreme events like cold wave and hot wave, heat wave, wind speeds. But there are something very important, for example, disaster, storm, flood, for example, has not been unread in this study. And for the health outcomes, there are still missing many important factors. So here we, for example, for the disease, we consider the infection disease, but there are something maybe more important, it's the non-communicable disease, such and there are some either chaine and way reflect the impact of climate change. For example, the malnutrition, and there are some kind of foodborne disease, for example, and health status, not mental disease. So that is something also very important to address, maybe if we have an opportunity in the future. For this chapter, because in the scope of the project, we want to evaluate for the whole country. So we have to use a very large scale survey data. For example, the labor force survey. So as Professor Long mentioned. So in the labor force survey, we have to use hourly wage as the proxy for labor productivity. If again, that is a limitation for the data. If we want to take it in a large scale level, if we have a small level, so we can have some focus on some specify on some special survey, and then it can measure better the labor productivity relate to age structure, for example, at Professor Long mentioned. So, but we would like to learn from you if you have some references on the data on labor productivity, because for the labor supply, hourly wage is a very good policy. Very, I think that very popular. But from the labor demand from the enterprise survey. So how about the labor productivity indicator can be used if we want to take into account for the country.
There's just one. I see one question by Aditya, just in case you.
Okay.
He raised his hands.
Okay.
Yeah, I should remark that I think so. This is one of the few studies I know which actually looks at the effect of climate change on health impacts very comprehensively for a country, for many diseases, because there are studies which will say what is the effect of climate change on incidence of malaria in the Ethiopian highlands. But this gives us a much better understanding. This study, I mean, of course, one can do a lot more work in terms of doing better econometric analysis and having more control variables. But even though I'm a contributor to a part of the whole study, but I think this particular chapter, as well as the entire study in itself, I think it is striking that this is one of the few comprehensive studies at a national level, looking at pretty detailed data for different diseases, different provinces. And I hope more people actually read this disease, because when we look at what is the effect of climate change on diseases, there's not a lot of systematic work out there. So I must commend this whole project for putting out there this very systematic study for the case of Vietnam. I hope other countries also undertake these kinds of projects and see what is the effect of climate change.
Yeah.
Thank you, Aditya. Maybe it's also worth noting that the effects are quite complicated depending on the disease, and it's not straightforward. So that the empirical strategy should look also at the different channels through which you may find the effect of the disease and climate change on the disease on the society or the economy. so looking at the map that Lanan showed, we can see that the effect is very heterogeneous depending on the location and the type of disease. So that's also one, I guess, important outcome of this chapter, is that it's quite complicated. So in the audience, if there are any questions, you may raise your hand and we give you the floor so that you can ask your question directly, or you can ask it on the chat. And if yeah,
I just want to add one thing related to the province population age structure related to health spending by health insurance. Some years ago we worked together with Vietnam Social Security Agency, and we explore the data from 63 provinces in Vietnam. And we have the population age structure of each province in the past 5 years from 2012 until 2016, and it shows very clearly that the province or city with more, higher proportion of older person, especially for those 80 and over. They have much more spending by health insurance, on both inpatient and outpatient treatment, and that is why naturally, people at different age, they also have different kind of disease. So maybe the weather condition, the climate change, maybe impact more seriously on the situation. So I do agree with you that there are a number of channels that impact on health of people. From like just very nature one. When you get old, maybe you are more, weaker, right? But at the same time, the living condition maybe add up to that kind of weaknesses. So I think that maybe combining with other data set, maybe we can provide more evidence on the impact of climate change on health of people in Vietnam. Especially, I do agree with Professor Nguyen that like a population projection for the long time until 2069 by very new by GSO, showing that Vietnam will be aged population by middle of this century, and given the current middle income country status like Vietnam, I think that a lot of challenges for Vietnam to dealing with situation of health for kind of rapidly aging population. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you very much. I think you named it. So it's really a first study based on very nice data sets that we managed to find and work on. But for sure, from there to more policy oriented conclusion, there is need to analyze the different channels, and that's also one aspect of the follow-up reports we're working on for COP27 on the adaptation this year. So in a very short time frame, I hope we will have some more recommendations on these aspects. I see one element. Yeah, Marie-Noël, you want to say something? Maybe last question.
Yeah, I just wanted to comment on the graph that was shown on the projected number of deaths per 100,000 people due to heat waves. I was quite surprised to see that even for the RCP 8.5, the mortality risk seems to remain so low. Because you might be aware that there was those studies from Mora in 2017 and also other papers since then showing that the heat and humidity conditions in most tropical areas in the worst case scenario, such as RCP 8.5, might reach nearly lethal or lethal conditions by the end of the century or even earlier. So I would suggest that it might be interesting beyond statistical estimates to have a look at the absolute values of temperature and humidity, maybe looking at the well bulb temperature, to have an estimate of the number of days in the dangerous ranges of heat and humidity conditions in the future. Because maybe there might be some thresholds in the future that are maybe not captured by statistics made on present day data.
Maybe that's a question for Viet Cuong. If you are still with us, Viet Cuong.
Yeah, so actually in the graph, we estimate the number of deaths per 100,000 people. So it's not the total number of the deaths caused by climate change. So in order to compare the two figures, I think I need to look at the prediction in other studies. So you see, because here we look at the project on the death rate, the number of deaths per 100,000. Yeah.
Okay, so I think there is a good argument in trying to analyze the absolute conditions for basically of conditions combining humidity and temperature, where there might be an absolute threshold beyond which it's actually quite hard to remain in good health, except maybe if you're indoors with the stronger cold things like that. So air conditioning. Yeah. Thank you.
Yeah, right. Yeah. Thank you.
But I think in the literature you can find the two approaches in parallel, and they might complement to each other.
Indeed. In the literature you find both, and for me it's really a question to see papers based on statistics which shows an increase in the number of deaths, but not as high as suggests papers looking only at dangerous thresholds, saying we can't because heat stress much depends on activity and gender and age and etc. We can't say how many people could die, but we know that we are going to reach dangerous thresholds even for healthy young people. And for me, yeah, indeed, there is a kind of discrepancy in the literature.
Aditya?
Yeah, I just want to engage in this discussion, the point raised. I think so there are two or three different things. One is Vietnam has a relatively younger population than some other countries. Secondly, there are likely to be threshold effects, which these projections are not perhaps fully capturing. The third thing is that as there is a greater heat waves and changes in precipitation, there's also going to be changes in land use, and people who are vulnerable, their underlying situation is going to change. They may become migrants, they may lose arable area, may not become arable anymore, there may be coastal erosion. Other things can happen which may make them more susceptible, more exposed to these, more susceptible to extreme weather conditions, which I understand this study cannot capture, but I think so. These are things which, looking at the data, cannot tell us. But I think so. This needs to be thought about in a larger context. What exactly are general effects on socioeconomics, the patterns of interaction, patterns of production of climate change. Yeah, so I think so. Yeah, there's a lot more that can be done. It's just a beginning of the thinking of the big project.
Thank you, Aditya. I think actually maybe that these two parallel methods are not measuring exactly the same thing. One is measuring a biophysical condition and just counting if people remain in the same place, the number of deaths that would occur. And the other is a more socioeconomic approach, looking at the adaptation to these conditions and in a socioeconomic perspective. And at some point, there should be coherent at some point, but they are not yet because we don't have the complete picture of the future for sure. There is one question in the audience from Tuan. I will try to allow you to speak, Tuan. I think you can speak now.
Thank you so much, Ed.
But we can't hear you. Yeah.
Can you hear me?
Yes, yes.
Thank you so much, Etienne, and thank you so much, presenters, for very insightful and complex studies about very important issues. With regard to Marielle's comments, I think no one can capture the change, the technology change and the adaptation in the previous study that may affect on the results of the effects of the climate change on mortality. For example, by the end of the century, we have a lot of improvement in health technology, which can help to reduce the severe effects of temperatures and climate change on mortality. So in this study, I think the authors just try to isolate on one angle, that try to estimate the effects of temperatures on mortalities, consider all else equals, and just to isolate, and everything is unchanged by the end of the centuries. I think that's a critical assumption here. Thank you, Tim. That's just my comments about it.
Thank you, Tuan. And if there is no further reaction, I think we had a nice discussion. It went more and more on the methodological issues by the end. So I guess it's to be continued. We will stop there, and we just announced the next webinar, which is happening next week, same time, Wednesday, 9:30 European time, 3:30 in Vietnam, with on the topic of energy demand and supply. So the impacts of climate change on energy demand and supply in Vietnam, which in the current context of new net zero objectives that Vietnam announced at COP26 becomes more and more relevant topic. So this session will be chaired by Professor Le Van Chon from Ho Chi Minh University and Dr. Manh Hung Nguyen from an expert from the Energy Institute. So the GEM Vietnam webinar series continues next week. Thank you all for your attention and the very nice discussions we had. Talk to you very soon.
Thank you very much.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Thank you very much. Goodbye.
Okay, bye-bye.